Hello there, my hobby streak videos are kind of turning into painting guides, so what I thought I'd do was I'd separate the two, so that way the hobby streak videos would be a lot shorter, and then I can do separate painting guides by themselves. So this is the Master of the Universe Wave 5 Fisto. Starting with the guards, I used some orc flesh contrast paint to cover any areas that needed to be green. While that was drying, I then went ahead and started painting Fisto's boots, belt, and the sort of underside of his armour with some Nagaroth Night, which was then given a wash of Druchii Violet. Moving back to the men-at-arms, I gave them another coat of orc flesh to really deepen that colour. Once that had dried, I used some Warpstone Glow to start picking out the muscles. I then mixed in some Moot Green to the Warpstone Glow just to start picking out the highlights on the muscles, followed by pure Warpstone Glow to finish off those highlights. With the green out of the way, I then painted the furry pants with some Basil Canum Grey contrast paint. I gave it a couple of layers just to make sure it was nice and deep. While that dried, I mixed in some Xerxes Purple to the Nagaroth Night to start highlighting the boots and the belt of Fisto. Then it was just Xerxes Purple by itself, followed by adding a little bit of Slaanesh Grey into the mix for that final highlight. We'll then move back to the guards and use some Eshin Grey to start highlighting the bits of the loincloth. We'll then use some Mechanicus Standard Grey just to do the very tips. We'll then use a mix of Mechanicus Standard Grey and Dawnstone just for the absolute tips and the very edges of the loincloth. Next up, I'll use some matte white to tidy up the areas of the armour that got any green on them as we're about to paint them orange. And for that, we'll use some Gryph-hound Orange contrast paint. While the contrast paint dries, we'll move back to Mephisto and paint his loincloth with some Dryad Bark, which we'll then dry brush with a mix of Dryad Bark and Gorthor Brown. Finally, we'll give it another dry brush just with some straight Gorthor Brown just to really pick out those details. With that, the contrast paint should be dry, so we're going to go ahead and use some Fire Dragon Bright just to start picking out the details and the platelets on the armour. We'll then throw in some matte white into the mix, just a small amount, just to really pick out those details on the armour. Then we'll move on to starting the skin tones. For that, I'm going to use some Bugman's Glow all over any areas that contain any flesh. Now that'll then receive a wash of Reikland Flesh Shade. After the shade is dry, we're going to use a tiny little bit of black to mark out the eyes. Then we'll very carefully go over it again with some matte white. And while I've got the white out, I'll highlight the teeth on both the men-at-arms guards. And then we'll go back to the black and very carefully do a tiny little dot for the pupil of the eye. We'll then use some Bugman's Glow to tidy up the shading so we can start making those muscles pop. We'll add a little bit of Cadian Flesh Tone into the Bugman's Glow just to, again, really start bringing out those muscles, which will be followed by Cadian Flesh Tone just by itself. We'll then throw some Kislev Flesh into the mix just to start highlighting the muscle definition and really start to sell how strong these guys are. And then finally some Kislev Flesh just on the very edges just to finalise the skin. I'll then move on to the helmets and the belts of the two guards. I'm using Armour and Blue for that. 2 coats will do as I'm painting over white, so it will show through a little. I'll then use Contrast Medium and Akellan Green just as a wash for all areas so we can get sort of quite a nice shading going on. While that shade dries, I'll then move on to Iron Hand Steel and I will start to paint in all the armour on Fisto, and I'll also paint the weapons on the 2 guards as well. I'll then use some Lamia Medium and Druchii Violet to get a nice shading on all of the metal on the armour of Fisto, while I use a mix of Contrast and Basil Canum Grey on the weapons for the guards. After doing that, the blue shade is dry, so I'll mix some Armour and Blue and some Temple Guard Blue just to start highlighting the helmet and the belt, followed up by some Temple Guard Blue just to really emphasise all those highlights. Finally, I mix in a very small bit of matte white into the Temple Guard Blue just to do the tiniest of highlights on each of the areas. Now that the contrast paint on the weapons is dry, I'll go ahead and use a little bit of Iron Hand Steel mixed with some Stormhost Silver just to start highlighting all those areas. And then I'll use Stormhost Silver just by itself to get those final points. I need to throw in a little bit of gold on the guards' helmets, so I'll paint that in now. And I'll do a tiny little bit of Stormhost Silver into the mix just so I can make a highlight. With Fisto now dry as well, we'll once again use the Stormhost Silver just to pick out the details on all of the armor. Finally, I'm going to use some Doombull Brown to actually paint in his hair. I'm also going to paint his eyebrows as well. All of it will then get a quick wash with some Agrax Earthshade. And while that shade dries, we'll use some Mechanicus Standard Grey just to start painting in the rocks or the stones on the base. I then used some Dawnstone Grey and picked out the details on the rocks. You'll also notice there's a big blob of Dawnstone Grey on Fisto's hands. Don't worry, I did notice that a little bit later, and I completely cleaned it up and repainted it. That's one of the main reasons why you should always have you'll use a wet palette, because when you have to sort of fix problems like that, it's a lot easier to do. After that, I went ahead and painted any wood on the bases with Dryad Bark. And I also painted what appears to be some sort of metal area with some Iron Hand Steel. I then gave the base a quick wash with some watered down Agrax Earthshade. Once the shade was dry, I used some Carrick Stone to dry brush a quick highlight over the whole base. I then gave the bases a couple of coats of Abaddon Black around the rims. I then painted the facing indicator on the base with some matte white, and we are finished. And there we are. I'm pretty happy with the results, and I really hope that it's helped you if you're trying to paint these and you weren't really sure what to do. Thanks very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, and if you want to see more, subscribe, and I will catch you next time. Thanks again. Bye for now.